What hasn't changed is, from a treasurer's perspective, fraud is no longer an exception. It's a daily operational risk we have to manage. And we've known that for a long time. That's something that's always been part of our purview. But that's what we do every day. But what has changed is that we've seen a huge increase in the volume, the dollar amount, and I think most concerningly is the credibility of these fraud attempts. And a lot of that is due to the use of AI-powered fraud schemes. What used to be the occasional low-quality scam that we were all used to seeing, poor spelling, and something that we could recognize was fraudulent, they're now frequent, they're well-timed, and most concerningly is they're exceptionally convincing and deceptive. And from my experience over the last couple of years, it's not really just the volume of fraud that we're concerned about. It's this asymmetry or lopsidedness of how companies are detecting fraud versus how the fraudsters are coming about these schemes with their innovations and their attacks on our companies. The fraudsters are able to innovate daily. This is their job. They work on these innovative schemes, while companies were still relying for the most part on manual fraud control methods, which is reactive. And frankly, it's unsuccessful in the long-term approach from our side as corporates. It's no longer opportunistic. The scale, the speed, and the sophistication that we're seeing now from the treasurer seat is fundamentally different to what we've seen and grown up with in our treasury careers over the last few years. And like you said, it's thanks to these AI-generated scams. And criminals, they're doing a great job using AI to scale deception instantly. And in our companies, we're really relying on ourselves as humans to spot these increasingly sophisticated attacks. It's really scary. And that is not a sustainable defense model. You can't train humans, I don't believe, to outrun machines. We know that AI didn't create fraud. It's just automating it, it's scaling it, it's speeding it up. And in order for Treasury departments to have any chance of success, we have to fight the technology with like technology. Manual controls still persist because they're familiar. They're what we have in our company. They're inexpensive. And historically, to be honest, they've worked because it has been a slower environment where we've been able to spot the scams, like I mentioned earlier, with just incorrect spelling or just something that we could recognize. And we know now that manual callbacks are very ineffective against today's AI-powered fraud. And we cannot scale with AI-driven fraud and payment rails with these types of methods. And these manual controls mean our treasury teams and our payment teams are applying yesterday's tools to today's threat. And I think it's largely because modernization of systems takes time, it takes effort, it takes budget, it takes experienced treasury personnel, and of course it takes cross-functional change because we need IT departments, we need the payment teams, we need accounting teams to help us in this big change. But, we have to meet the threat with comparable tools if we have any chance of success. And that means as well that we have to convince our C-suite, our IT C-suite to help us implement these changes. Otherwise, we're not going to be successful. From my assessment and my experience, they fail under speed and volume. We have end-of-month pressure. We have urgent payment requests, especially at year-end. We have high vendor turnover. And those are exactly the conditions that fraud exploits. Humans are most vulnerable when we are rushed or overloaded. And AI-powered fraud is designed to exploit these vulnerabilities. And treasury and payment teams are really built and we're hired for our speed and precision. But at the same time, the sensitivity is often leveraged by fraudsters. And I say often that we have to practice security over immediacy. This has to be the mindset of anyone who is involved in payments. And we know that a deliberate, accurate payment is far preferable to a rush transaction that exposes the company to fraud. And therefore, when we're under pressure, we have to remember the foundation that we have to verify before allowing a payment to go out. You know, in large companies, I don't think that readiness is necessarily a policy issue. It's more an execution issue. Like we spoke about earlier, you know, to make any changes to our systems, to ready us for these changes, we rely on stakeholders in our company, such as AP, IT, but we also rely on the data being correct in the system, and we need our vendors to also work together with us. So when controls are fragmented, or maybe the data isn't continuously validated, compliance is going to become much harder in practice. And we know that regulations tend to move faster than operational change, particularly in bigger companies. And I don't think that companies are necessarily falling behind because we don't understand the regulations, or we're not aware of them, or they're unclear. I think it's really because we're struggling with changing our setup, modernizing our systems. We have internal controls, we have the data validation, and we have automation levels that are really not keeping up at the same pace as these regulatory requirements. And in order to do that, again, we need a top-down buy-in fraud prevention approach. And that's going to require not only our C-suite buying into these projects, but also resources, because treasury teams are typically one of the smaller finance functions. So we need time, we need resources, we need budget allocation, and we need support for organizations to adhere to these changes. And in today's operating environment, fraud prevention and adherence to regulations should not be a battle in companies. We see the dangers of fraud. We see these schemes that are being perpetrated in our companies. And so these types of changes should be treated with the same urgency and rigid compliance as other accounting and audit controls. And I believe this is where Treasury has to step up, and our leaders need to influence change and get buy-in and support from our C-suite for us to be able to keep up with these changes. I think what needs to change is we have to move from being detectors of errors to actually preventing them right at the forefront. I think when SOX came into effect, our treasury teams were really pushed into embedding controls directly into the payment and vendor processes, rather than relying on after the fact reviews and approvals. And, you know, we have to be able to detect suspicious entries. And now with these new notch rules as well, not only do we have to detect the entries, but we also have to have defensible action that proves we are doing our best part. So we're doing our part to ensure that we're preventing any fraud. And what used to be, you know, in our teams was a good faith effort. I don't think that's going to be acceptable after June when Archer rules come into effect. Companies are going to have to prove that they're monitoring the behavior, they're training their teams, and they're documenting these decisions. If we don't do that and we don't have this concrete evidence, we're not going to meet the standards. And this regulation, SOX has been around for a long time, but the notch rules, I don't think it's catching companies by surprise, but I think it's more about complacency, where companies don't necessarily spend the time and the effort and the resources ensuring that we're up to date with our fraud prevention processes. It's still something that we have to invest in companies. We have to train our teams, and we have to basically recognize the fraud indicators and ensure we're ahead of where the fraudsters are perpetrating our companies. It almost feels like companies think, you know, confidence is a control, but it's not. fraud fraud thrives really in that gap between what you believe is correct and actually verifying it. And that's what we're seeing in those statistics. And I think also, with internal audit departments and the audit that we go through, the controls look much stronger on paper. But when you really get into testing them, that's when you see, these statistics come up. Fraud is really what tests us in real time. So even if we have the controls on paper, if we're not putting them into practice, that's when fraud happens. And I think it goes back to what I said earlier, that, we're measuring confidence against yesterday's controls. Nothing appears wrong until it is. Payments go out successfully, the vendors get paid. This creates a false sense of security, not actual resilience. And that's what's showing up again in the confidence statistics you have. And like we said, without continuous validation, our teams are trusting the static data in a very dynamic risk environment. And it also could be that, during the whole P2P process, we are relying on different stakeholders and different teams to enter information, to verify information right until when the payment goes out. And I think it means we have to be much more collaborative in our teams and make sure that each team that passes along a payment in the process is verifying and making sure that it's not just static data that they're relying on. Treasury is very much a interfacing part of the finance department. We're not a silo, and everyone involved in payments has to be confident that their controls are holding up to fraud. What's changed also is the way Treasury teams look at fraud. We need to be more of an enterprise risk manager in the Treasury department because we know that speed without verification is just another risk exposure for us. So we have to know the risks that come with instant payment. We have to, delight our customers and our vendors who are asking for instant payments. So we have to be sure that we know these risks and we're defending against them. So what we're seeing is, this flip in the Treasury fraud posture, where we go from detect and recover to prevent and contain. So we know that with instant payments or any type of payment, fraud is now almost starting upstream of us. And the faster the payment, the more challenging and the more risk involved. So our Treasury teams are shifting really from chasing fraud to actually being the gatekeeper and blocking it. We have to be able to change that mindset of where we were in previous years. We were the processor of payment. Now we have to be the blocker of any payment that goes out of the door. And to go back to what you were saying about the instant payments and the faster reaction time, is that it used to be, a wire took a couple of hours, or an ACH is a batch process. With real-time payments, the reaction time is shrinking to seconds. So we don't have the luxury of detection anymore. Fraud prevention has to happen way before the payment is released. And that, again, goes back to verification, automation, and having clean data. So our controls have to operate in real time and no longer in batches as we are used to in the past. We've definitely been seeing that where, like you said, onshoring or just changing vendor data. And that we know is a risk that we have to mitigate. And again, we have to make sure that we don't start our payment process with bad data. If the vendor data isn't continuously verified, it's outdated. And this shows itself up now with all these changes in the geopolitical environment. And it just means we have to be on our toes. We have to be proactive all the time and make sure that we in the Treasury department can support the business. If that's what the business needs to do and needs to make payments to different vendors than we were used to or that are already in our system, the Treasury and the payment team need to be proactive and ensure that we can help the business future-proof itself and we have to be able to manage verification of these different types of vendors. So yes, it's happening, we're seeing it, and we just have to have the tools in place to make sure we can protect the company from these risks. Fraud incident consumes so much time. It takes the employees' time, the leadership time, it disrupts operations, and then, downstream, it damages trust with our vendors, our customers, and it can have real consequences for the employees involved. And from the Treasury perspective, fraud is not just a line item loss. It's not just the dollar values that go out the door incorrectly. It's an organizational crisis for us. $1 million fraud does not only cost $1 million, it costs months of disruption and, like you said, sometimes careers, sometimes turnover in companies. And then there's also that hidden cost of fraud, which I've seen, is burnout, because teams are spending days fixing an issue that should never really have happened. And if prevention doesn't happen before the payment, it's already too late. But at the same time, I do think that if companies are not arming their employees with the tools to prevent and detect fraud, then we're just kicking the can down the road. It can't only always be the employee who's, as a human trying to detect these machine-created fraud attempts. We also have to help our companies and our employees fight the fraud, the AI-powered fraud, with tools. Otherwise, we're going to see this continue to happen, and it's going to cost us real dollars, and real lives are impacted. It's not the question of, will fraud increase? It's absolutely going to increase, but it's whether our companies are modernizing enough and fast enough to survive it. And what we need to do as the Treasury and payment teams is to modernize these Treasury fraud prevention techniques. And a lot of that comes with implementing tools to help us. And these techniques are all around real-time decisioning, AI pattern recognition, and continuous modernization and monitoring instead of that daily review. And this means we have to shift, like we'd spoken about earlier, from those many manual reactive controls to preventative and automated ones. And that means we need budget and we need systems and tools to help us do this. And when we have these systems in place, I believe the biggest gain we get is from removing opportunities from errors before the payments ever move. And it's my belief, really, that from a Treasury perspective, modern fraud isn't really a people problem. It's much more of a systems problem. And systems can be fixed. And I think that's where we, as Treasury and company teams, need to focus our dollars and our perspective and our time and effort.